First, reaction is coming in thick and fast to the first major review of Australia's COVID response. The sweeping review found Australians would be unlikely to accept lockdowns again if there was another pandemic, pointing to the erosion of public trust following the tough decisions taken during the crisis.
The reviewers did hail what they describe as courageous decisions taken early in the pandemic, which prevented the death toll from being several times higher, but found that as the pandemic wore on, communication with the public on the reasons behind decision-making was often poor. The Health Minister, Mark Butler, will join us live on the program a little later. But first, let's go to our political reporter, Isobel Roe in Canberra. Good morning, Isobel. First of all, can you just take us through the main findings?
Yeah, well, it really did centre around this theme of erosion of public trust, and what started as the goodwill of Australians at the beginning of the pandemic, when it was this scary thing that we didn't understand. When we started to see inconsistencies in the way states handled it, the report said that that erosion of trust really appeared and people became more sceptical. And in fact, the Health Minister, Mark Butler, said yesterday that he thinks, reading the report, that we're actually worse off to deal with the pandemic again now because of that erosion of public trust. Now, the report is not all bad. It goes to some of the really good things that Australia did early on. It talks about some of the economic stimulus. It talks about a courageous decision from the former Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, to close the international border. But it also talks about some of those trust issues which started to come from that. For example, what they describe as a lack of proper consideration of human rights in that border closure. Mandates for vaccines, they say they believe, has led to some sort of erosion in the way that a reduction in the way parents are vaccinating their children, and they've seen a slight drop in vaccination rates. People, they say, are unlikely to accept lockdown measures like that again. It also went to some of the economic measures. It talked about JobKeeper. We all remember that payment that tied an employee to their workplace so that they weren't going to be fired if they may have been let go. It talked about that being a really quick and a clever measure, but adding too much stimulus to the economy. And the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, jumped on that yesterday to say that is the reason why we are feeling some of these cost of living pressures now. And this inquiry was led by Robin Crook, AO, a public servant, Catherine Bennett, an epidemiologist, and economist, Dr. Angela Jackson. What it didn't do was delve into the state response and speak to premiers, and so there's not a lot of detail around some of those state-led measures.
The report also found, Isobel, that another pandemic is very likely, so we need to get ready now. Has the government announced any changes?
Well, its major takeaway in its big announcement yesterday was this, the setting up of a formal Centre for Disease Control. We were one of the only OECD countries that didn't have one when the pandemic started. So they've announced $251 million for the CDC. There is an interim one that's operating at the moment, but it will be a formal setup now. And that's the sort of body that would lead a response in the future, coordinate between states and the Commonwealth, and lead the health response. There's also a series of other recommendations that are made around the rights of children, around formalising some of those, lists of who does what in a pandemic, making sure we have enough vaccines, for example, in the future. And in terms of the response to those specific inquiries, recommendations, the government says it will meet for Cabinet on Monday to discuss its official response to them.
All right, Isobel, thank you.
A school community in Melbourne's east is coming to terms with the scene of unimaginable horror after a car crashed into a school ground yesterday, killing an 11-year-old boy. Stephanie Ferrier is at Auburn South Primary School for us now. Steph, awful event. What have police had to say?
Good morning, Bridget. Yes, police say that they have now released the 40-year-old woman driver from Hawthorn East pending further inquiries, and they say that they believe that she had just picked up her child from Auburn South Primary behind me, and she was attempting to do a U-turn when somehow her car veered off the road and crashed through this steel fence behind me and into the school grounds. Now, in there were 5 children who were sitting at a table in the school grounds. Sadly, this 11-year-old boy was critically hurt and he died on the way to hospital. There were 4 other kids who also suffered serious injuries. Now, 2 of those have been listed as serious but stable, and the other 2 are in a stable condition. They were 2 11-year-old girls and a boy and a girl aged just 10 years old. But police say that this is a very tough situation for everybody involved, even the first responders, obviously involving children and having to take witness statements here and look after those children who have been very badly hurt. Now, they say that it's still simply too early to say exactly how this happened. Earlier on, we heard from the Education Department, a spokesperson who said that it might have been a medical episode. Police say that it's still too early to work that out. There were P plates on this car. However, it's still too early to determine the exact status of the driver as well. And they say that this could take weeks to actually work out and form this investigation.
And Steph, do we know whether the school will open this week? What are the plans for students who must be really traumatised at this time?
Yes, Bridget, we've heard from the Education Minister, Ben Carroll, who says that the Education Department is standing by and ready to offer the school whatever supports it needs. Obviously, you can imagine that there would need to be counselling involved. We heard from people who said that parents were picking up their kids after this happened yesterday afternoon, hugging and consoling their kids. It would have been a very traumatic situation for the entire school community. And Jacinta Allan, the Premier, has put out a post on social media saying basically that what should have been an unremarkable sunny afternoon has had this really dark shadow that's been cast over the city and the state. And she says that everybody is going to hug their close loved ones that little bit harder. And we've also heard from the opposition leader as well. He says that this has been absolutely heartbreaking for this very tight-knit community, and he's also expressed his sincere condolences to a local family that is now dealing with the loss of a loved one. Of course, he's the local member. So we're going to be hearing from witnesses to this, as well as from the Premier and the opposition leader here a little later on News Breakfast. But of course, Bridget, our hearts go out to that family who is waking up this morning without their little boy.
Yeah, I just can't imagine. Steph, thank you so much for taking us through that.
Well, let's get some other news now. And the US envoy of the UN Security Council has renewed calls for Israel to allow food, medicine and other supplies into Gaza. Speaking at a UN Security Council briefing on the Middle East, Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield urged Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to reconsider banning the UN's Palestinian aid agency, UNRWA.
We know that right now there is no alternative to UNRWA when it comes to delivering food and other life-saving aid in Gaza. Therefore, we have concerns about this legislation being implemented.
Federal Environment Minister Tanya Plibersek has approved Southern Launch's proposed Whalers Way rocket launch complex on South Australia's Eyre Peninsula, despite pushback from conservation groups and local residents. The decision paves the way for the company to launch rockets from the site on South Australia's Eyre Peninsula. State Planning Minister Nick Champion still needs to approve the proposal for it to go through.
A developing legal crisis fuelled by insufficient funding of the Northern Territory's Legal Aid Commission is starting to affect the justice system. In Darwin this week, a man charged with serious offences was granted bail, partly because it was uncertain whether his trial next year could go ahead without access to a lawyer. The Northern Territory's Chief Minister, Leah Finocchiaro, says she's negotiating more funding with the federal government.
A 91-year-old Perth woman who almost lost thousands of dollars in a gift card scam is warning others to be careful. The woman says she received a phone call from a man claiming to represent her bank. He then convinced her to buy $2,000 worth of gift cards, but a checkout operator stopped the transaction.